Ivan, your speech was pretty scary.
Pretty?
Scary.
Uh-huh.
Now people are trembling in the room right now. Getting back to the electrical vehicles and the China domination in the resources. Well, if not electrical vehicles, probably the other issues, need different metals like copper, aluminum, and others. And I understand from you that China already put the hand on the most of those. What the Western world would do with that? They have to do something about it. And we saw in the past, the small revolutions, coups, whatever, change in the power. Where does that lead us?
I don't know where it leads. The world, I think, people will get smarter and they will have to find a way to make batteries without some of those components. Lithium is readily available around the world. And they're already making lithium-ion batteries, but it doesn't give you the same distance. If you want long-distance trucks, long-distance vehicles, it doesn't work. You're going to need those commodities. But I am sure over time someone will find a way to use less cobalt or less nickel or those components in the battery, so there will be sufficient cobalt and nickel. That's what I'm hoping. There will be a solution. If not, the other point is we just won't be so aggressive on electric vehicles because all Western countries will have to say we will invest in Indonesia and we will go compete against the Chinese in Indonesia and we will go big into the DRC and we will go to more risky countries where Western countries are scared to go. And they may be forced there. But the big BHPs, Rio Tinto, Anglo, etc., they don't go to those countries. It's generally only the Chinese who go there. So I think they're going to be forced to maybe go there. But there's going to have to be a shift by those companies.
Saulius, what's your view on that?
I'm also a stronger believer in technology. I think we will, as humanity, we will start figuring that out. We're already hearing about solid-state batteries and a potential revolution there. We'll see how the subsequent tests are going to go. But I think also, if I just step back, Rolanda, I think because why we're saying why EVs, why move to EVs? Because of the energy transition. And we are very much thinking about, energy transition is about reducing the usage of the fossil fuels. But we very frequently forget the takeout, the recycling part, the carbon capture and storage. And if I draw a parallel with the chemicals industry, right, we sorted out a lot of problems, at least in the Western world, with the polymers and chemicals industry, not by reducing the consumption, but by setting up better recycling. And this is what we need to think about from the transition perspective, how we can drive more investment into carbon capture and storage. Because these answers like EVs and transition overall, they take time.
Yeah.
They will take time.
Daniel?
I'd like to ask Ivan first. At the end of the day, don't we face a major choice? If we take the status quo and your great graphs and so on, and this is what's happening now, and this is the reality, of course, and it's hard to disagree, although I think by now the data regarding profitability of renewables is much better than it used to be only a few years ago, and, and very soon this is going to be very, very economic, but that's at the margin. I would have wished some discussion about nuclear power, because right,
I agree.
I just come from France, and how France did it versus Germany.
Yeah,
okay, so I think at some point we need to go one step beyond your presentation and say, well, what are the options? This looks gloomy, but we have options. 1993, 30 years ago exactly, what was, any guess, what was the tax, federal tax on a gallon in the US? 18.4 cents. What is it today, 2023? It's 18.4 cents to the gallon. This is a story about state capture, not capture by the state of anybody else. It's captured by the automobile, oil, and other industries that do that. So at what point we just put the whole picture together and give These are the choices. Politically, it's probably impossible in the next year or two that the US would do something about that. It could be political suicide. But we need to start at least a major debate about why are we addicted to oil and gas in this particular way, and I think there are options. Chile, just to say about Chile, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is part of the depletion of natural resources. Fortunately, Chile has been much more efficient in producing copper than the rest of the world, so they still remain competitive. And Codelco is pretty good, but then the privates are even better. But we didn't talk about lithium and what's happening in Chile and lithium, which just got $6 billion bonus, fiscal bonus, because they did it very well on that. And that's the way different countries have to do it, and it's part of the shifts that are happening towards the critical minerals, which are absolutely crucial for renewables. If we think in terms of having non-traditional choices, not subscribing to the status quo, we do have a chance, and it's not so gloomy, because I don't think we have a choice unless we don't believe that we are on a path of climate catastrophe. So if we don't have a choice, we need to consider all these other options, including those that are politically incorrect in the US and other places.
Yeah.
Avishai, you want to come to part?
Economic advisor.
US.
The US. Clinton was president, and I was the World Bank. I went to see him there, and I said, Joe, here is the opportunity. Increase the tax on, on gas, like you said before. You have so much money. You have so much money for infrastructure, education. He told me, Avishai, how old he was with Clinton? He said, you want me to lose the election?
Yeah. At Rolandas.
True story.
It's for the audience.
Please, Seven.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. What we see there, renewable, the option, fossil fuel, I'm totally in agreement. The only solution that the world's going to find, either batteries, etc., of course, a certain amount, nuclear. That's our solution. Now, lithium, you're correct. Lithium is there, and Chile's done a great job. The good thing about lithium, it's available all over the world. You don't have to go to these corrupt, difficult countries. It's in Australia. It's all over. Chile, it's all over. So lithium's not a concern. It's the cobalt, it's the copper, it's those ones. So that's where I agree with you. The world to overcome the solution is nuclear. But who's going to switch around? We've just said Germany shut all their nuclear plants. Who's going to open them? Look what's happened in Germany. Is the United States going to build a new nuclear plant somewhere? Then you talk about gas price of the world. People do find solutions. I mean, we're not sitting bleak like that. It looks bleak. Someone's going to find the solution, nuclear, etc. But you talk about America. Look what America did. They were dependent on the rest of the world for a large amount of their oil and gas. And some guy discovered how to get shale gas. And they learned how to get the gas out of the rock. And what has happened in America today, they're the biggest exporter of LNG. So yeah, the world, please God, will find a solution with some great innovation, which we've seen with the shale gas.
But Ivan, we just got the question from the audience. So why nuclear power is so ignored these times? It was obvious before 2-3 years ago, but now.
I'm not a nuclear expert. Maybe you can say, why doesn't someone build new nuclear plants? Why did Germany shut them down? I'm not a nuclear expert. Safety fears. We just saw what happened in Japan.
Schroeder.
We cannot ignore also the economic aspect of nuclear. Because if we look at the nuclear projects, these are not your typical capex project, which is 2, 3, 4 years, and then you start getting a return. These are much longer. And if you look at the returns, and if you look also at the cost of nuclear, the existing technologies, it is very difficult to execute those projects without very strong government support. And it's not only about the public policy, but also someone putting money on the table. So this is why we see that those projects that are now going forward in the world, like Abu Dhabi program or Saudi program or Chinese program, is where government is actually putting money in. So that is one aspect. So the nuclear industry, for it to resurrect, and I agree from a solution perspective, it would be a perfect part in this equation, absolutely. But it needs also to reinvent itself in terms of how these projects are structured, priced, and executed. Because currently, they are too big for your usual private investor to come in and execute.
What about where there was big talk about mini nuclear plants? Is that a possibility?
Yes, the small nuclear power plants. That could be one of the options. It could be. We still need to see how this evolves, and that creates now a lot of buzz.
Elon Musk.
if there is a disruption there, so that could be the solution.
We have a comment from Yeshai who says we underestimate technological progress. For example, an average car electrical harness is 3 miles. New designs are the 300 feet. This is a lot of copper to be saved.
Yeah.
If I can just quickly comment, I agree. When it comes to cars, absolutely. But where we will need copper, and especially the old world, is the cities. I mean, to install all the grid and reinforce all the grid that you need, we still don't have alternative technology. We still cannot deliver that electricity via air or other means.
You've got to upgrade the grid considerably.
Absolutely.
You've got to create all these new charging facilities. As he says, we don't have the alternative energy, which requires a lot more copper. So the grids in every country really has to be upgraded. Even, just take America, even without the electric vehicle, the grid has to be upgraded. America's grid is so poor today.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying. Okay, no. I just shout. No. Found it. Hello?
Yes, it's on.
On. So I'm saying the last mile in every country need an investment in copper, and definitely. I think that the overall grid, at least from what we see in California, and California is #1 in adopting electric car, the bottlenecks are not as huge as people expected. I think the efficiencies of the car themselves surprised people that the peak in demand is not as big as people expect.
Thank you, Shane. Well, I have a question which concerns all of us in this part of the world, especially. The war in Ukraine would end. I don't know when, but it would end. What would be the different or the same policies of European countries towards vis-a-vis Russian supply of natural resources? What would change in comparison with 2019? Or could it happen so that a few years later, the things would come back to the same like it was 2019?
My personal opinion, we're going to have no option but to go back to Russian gas. Because my fear is what has happened here in Europe, and Europe is going towards LNG, and they're building new LNG terminals, and we know Germany's built a massive amount of LNG storage tanks and terminals to discharge the LNG. But we are very dependent on the United States to export LNG. And Michael, you're an oil guy, you maybe know that better than me. How long can the United States keep exporting LNG to the extent they have to do to now to keep Europe alive? Because when the American economy grows and gets bigger and bigger and bigger and grows, they're going to need a lot more of that gas there. And how much of the shale gas do they have at these low costs in America? And that's also going to dry up and it's not in abundant supply. So I think Europe to rely on American LNG, I think is a risky game. Number one, we've just seen today, Chevron having a strike today at its LNG gas facility in Australia. The gas price, I think, went up 18-20% today in Europe. But Chevron doesn't even export gas to Europe. Chevron mainly exports gas to Asia, but now the American gas that was going to Europe, the Asians are going to suck. So suddenly, I think earlier we were talking about trading gas and how important it is to trade gas because Lithuania is paying a particular price, they could trade it better. And it is traded and it moves around, but something happens there, boom, the whole thing goes up. So I think Europe relying on American LNG is not a good solution. So unfortunately, my belief, we may have no other option.
Saulius?
If we look from fossil fuels perspective, indeed gas is the transitional fuel. So that means that probably next decade, maybe longer, will be a decade of gas. That means gas demand is very likely to grow globally. And then then there is a very good question if US, in that case, can be still a net exporter of gas, or it will be, because if we look the last decade, Europe gas consumption was decreasing, US was growing and growing significantly. So US industry will depend a lot on gas, so the competition will be intensifying. And do we expect that other players will be ramping up, like Qatar, like UAE and others, and KSA as well? They also are very much doubling down on their programs. That is definitely going to happen, but how much this can offset, that's a good question. But I think probably Rolanda, I think maybe if I can just refine a little bit your question, I think it's also about that one thing is when you have gas supply by a pipe, and this is what Europe was very much dependent on. And another thing is when you have a fluid market like LNG, which is a global commodity. So how much of that infusion will be from Russia? That may not even depend on Europe or US. And we see that already. This rebalancing is already happening. So in other words, in a few years, one way or another, it's a good chance that Russian gas will still find a way into the global market.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything can find a way to the global markets. We know the experience with sanctions and so on. But I'll submit a somewhat different take to this. First, if we're talking about risk and risk around gas, take Germany, and I do an in-depth risk assessment between getting it from the US in 2030 or from Russia. I know which one is more risky. From the US side, there will be an issue of price. And one has to pay more. But relying on Russia, the lessons have been learned. We cannot long for the pre-war days. It's going to be a different regime post-war. And again, it's a choice. We need to all be ready. I think Germany already learned the lesson, and the world has been surprised. Maybe Martin has written about that, the extent to which they managed to weather the winter. They managed to do so much better than the catastrophe that was expected because of their complete reliance on Russian gas. And so I think some of these countries have learned their lessons, and politically and so on, it's a point of no return. Of course, some will get back, but the world is different. I would not underestimate, knowing a bit about Ukraine, if there is real peace, hopefully, in sometime in the future. Let's not underestimate the potential of Ukrainian gas. Okay, and that relates to what you were saying, that there are other sources that may be coming onshore and so on, and then there are other findings in other parts of the world. I do not subscribe, however, to the notion that gas will necessarily be the transitional source to that. It's a very problematic approach to consider gas the transitional source, because the technology that one is married to for the next 20 and 30 years is the old fuel, basically consuming technology, what's using the gas stoves and so on. So if we're serious about the energy transition, I think we need to seriously talk about whether gas can be the transitional fuel for a long time while the climate emergency is around. So I would again go back to transitional minerals, I would go back to nuclear, but I would go back, where is the role of governments and government regulations? Of course, the taxes in Europe are totally different than in the US and so on, but governments have a huge way to play. Just to finish on your point, of course, nowadays a president would lose an election, but that was a sense 20 years ago, 10 years ago also in Europe. In Europe, civil society and many others, and the young, coalesced around this, and nowadays it's much more consensus, and the reforms that they have done to really reflect the so-called negative externality of this. In Europe, it's a completely different picture in the US. Why do we totally underestimate the probability of that type of game change? What has happened this summer in the US, I think it is a wake-up call. And what has happened in Montana the ruling for the youth that their rights have been denied, for the young, for Montana, the state of Montana not protecting the environment and not doing more about that. These are wake-up calls. Something is beginning to happen. Ecuador just had a plebiscite of keeping oil under the ground and so on. So we need to talk about game changers and about activism and the mobilization. Of course, if we take the status quo, it's a very grim picture. We're not going anywhere.
You mentioned, Germany survived, yes, and Germany they managed to get the LNG. But look what's happened to the power prices in Germany. And if you say gas prices go up, LNG prices go up, Germany, which is an industrial nation, needs cheap power. How is it going to compete against the rest of the world with a power price that is playing in the same to the UK?
Yeah, look, to a different extent, we all need to pay for that. And that's what governments have to split in. Governments will have to provide more incentives, subsidies. You talked about the IRA and so on. All these programs will be multi-trillion dollars what's needed in terms of investment. And we taxpayers will have to pay if we make the choice that this is the way to go. Germany has to revamp its reliance on that and completely do it. Or say we can go back to the old days, which I don't think is feasible.
It's just in order for this to happen, it's also, do we have then one system around the world or one framework, whatever we call it, around carbon? Like, for example, electricity price. There is no global electricity price. I saw there was one question about electricity prices going through. There is no one electricity price. You can have electricity price collapsing in one region and growing exponentially in another. And this is what we've seen, by the way, last year, right? US versus Europe.
Exactly.
So to your point, it's not if one government decides, now let's transition and let's put money into that. And another government says, you know what, we are absolutely okay with our existing very competitive energy system, which provides a cheap electricity price. It will be very difficult for the industry, to your point, to compete in the future. So this is why it's a combination of, to your point, I fully agree, governments will need to step in, they will need to chip in and put money on the table and where their mouth is. But at the same time, you will need to start creating new global markets around carbon, maybe around electricity as well.
Kaimo Kusk, ambassador of Estonia, has the question. Shouldn't we use separation of democracies and authoritarian states when we assess their corruption level? How can non-democratic China do better than some democracies?
The expert at the end.
Actually, they don't. I mean, at least not in terms of corruption measures and corruption assessment or rating.
But the question probably about the economic consequences.
Right.
Economy-wise.
Yeah. So that's a very, very important question, and I think everybody should read Martin's books and columns and how China has managed to be very successful on many fronts, in particular economic, until recently. And I'm sure there's a lot to be said what's happening now, what's happening in the future, but until recently, in spite of very significant deficiencies in governance at least from our perspective. One of those is on corruption, although there have been periods where they have been trying to control it a bit better, although it has been very top up. But the other major weakness is obviously on voice and democratic accountability. They have managed to progress in spite of that. I didn't have the time, if I would have shown the chart with what has happened in China over time in all governance indicators. China has progressed enormously in the effectiveness of the bureaucracy and of the government over the years, and it's a very interesting comparison with many of the other countries that are being implicitly asked there, that are going in the wrong direction. So in terms of government and bureaucratic effectiveness, and there's a whole legacy and story of why is that. In terms of regulatory quality, there have been improvement, and mildly so on some areas of rule of law. and also basically they have maintained by fiat some political stability. So again, one has to basically look at the overall spectrum in terms of macroeconomic management with hiccups and so on, and others here, Avi and Martin and so on, can speak to that. They have done much better than so many other emerging economies. So one has to look at the totality. But at the end of the day, and I was reminding Martin, he wrote a column using our governance indicators about 15 years ago. At the end of the day, the question arises, if you're very weak on, say, absolutely key dimensions of governance, let's say 2, voice and accountability, and control of corruption, which China is, how sustainable is this for the medium to long term? You can still make gains for a few more years and so on. And some of us subscribe to the notion that China is in for very significant trouble, which is already starting. So countries that have done better in recent times and have been progressing on control of corruption and on voice and accountability, I see their prospects for 5, 10, 15 years ahead much better than China, unless China reforms in a major way. Governance is a long-term process, so things can happen in terms of growth. Growth can be very short-term, and there can be spurs and bubbles and so on, and they can take place in the short term. The question is what will happen in the next 10, 15 years, and I'm not optimistic at all about China if it continues on the path it is now.
And I have the last question to each of you, the same. If you would be the ultimate decision maker in this country, what would be your 3 priorities or 3 steps in securing the national interest in energy sector of this country? Ivan, not too difficult question for you.
Yeah, I still think for this I still believe somewhere in Europe we need more nuclear. And if you've got a nuclear plant somewhere, you've got stability. You're not relying on external factors. You're not relying on where you're getting your gas. You're not relying on importing electricity from other countries, etc. You get reliability and stability in your own country. It takes long. It's expensive. But you sleep at night.
That's one. Would you have second?
Oh, and then there too. I mean, that's the only thing you can do. The rest, as he says, you've got to have a good trading base for your LNG. You've got an LNG plant. You've got an LNG terminal. Put traders around it to make sure you're getting the cheapest LNG. Make sure you're doing it well. Make sure you're storing. Make sure you're getting the right price. You're trading. You're hedging. There are many things you can do with a good trading book. So, there's stuff they could do around that, I think. But so I think those are the major issues.
Saulius?
I agree regarding nuclear, especially that the country already has a base and a talent base that still remembers what nuclear means. But I would just look from a bit different perspective that because it's not only about how much we need to build in order for us, for the country and for the economy, but how can we be competitive in energy, how we can become a hub, maybe trading hub, maybe storage hub, maybe something else, but where Lithuania can actually build something where it will become attractive, both from a talent perspective, from investors' perspective, but also that Lithuania will be part of that new energy business of the future. So I would very much look into this, and right now I agree trading is one, storage, balancing, these are those areas that will grow very fast in the coming years.
Daniel?
It reminds me of, you had this fantastic summary chart, right? That, I'm always so impressed by the Venn diagrams of management consultants. I cannot replicate. I just focus on data points and so on, but you have this masterful. But I would ask, not the but, I would ask the more fundamental question, resilience, competitiveness. You mentioned that. Resilience is the fad of the day everywhere, all consulting firms, not just you. Everybody has to be resilient. But we in economics talk about what's endogenous and what's exogenous. So what are the fundamental factors that lead to resilience? You cannot, even as a management consultant, you cannot go to a country and give them an injection of resilience. That won't work. It's the outcome. It's an outcome of other more fundamental factors. So, to answer your question, I would focus on a diagnostic of the key different areas of institutions and governance and see how can we go to the next stage. I meant, well, what I said earlier, why can't, and I do that in many countries and with heads of states and so on, you have the glass half full or half empty, but why can't you be at least Germany, if not Denmark, in 10 years? And why I'm saying that, because that relates then to many of these other things that we're discussing. I'm somebody from out of town, so I'm not going to tell you the exact measure. That's for you guys, and you who know the situation here to decide what to do. The other factor I would think, also coming from a relatively a small country, this whole notion of independence and so on becomes quite tricky and relative for a small country. So the issue, the crucial issue from also an economic and security perspective becomes the strong alliances, so Baltic alliances, EU and so on. But the notion that you could be totally independent as a small economy is totally unrealistic. So instead, you have to look well beyond the boundaries and who are the reliable partners in terms of your risk factors, or your reliable partners to create partnerships and do it with the others, but not to try to have just our country are totally autarkically independent in energy and so on, which is totally unfeasible.
So, Daniel, Saulius, Ivan, thank you very much for flying so far away to join us in this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.